Hello all, and welcome to the first of two topic lectures for this week, the day July 30th, 2020. First, we'll talk about gender dynamics in Rome, aka the family. So first we're going to look at the familia, the Latin word for family, and the paterfamilias, the head of the Latin family. So the familia was the most important institution within Roman culture. It is patriarchal in that it is headed by the paterfamilias, who is the oldest living male ancestor on the father's side. He had complete control over the people and the property within his familia. The familia was all persons and property that fell under the power, potestas, of the paterfamilias. The family is the whole family, not just the nuclear family we think of. It includes the paterfamilias, children, sometimes the wife, although the wife often remained in the familia of her father, more on that soon. Grandchildren, slaves, freedmen, and other free client dependents, as well as all of the family's property. Harvey number 43 highlights the ownership and control under the paterfamilias. It states, the term familia also refers to any kind of group that is defined as having a status specific to the people in the group or status shared by the similar people. In the case of a specific status, we call a familia those several persons who, by virtue of nature or legal enactment, are under the power, potestas, of one person. This would include his wife, sons, daughters, and so on, as well as those that follow them, namely the grandsons and granddaughters. He continues to give us a legal definition of the paterfamilias. The name means father of the family. And he is called this even if he doesn't have any children of his own. This passage states, the person who has control over the household is called the paterfamilias. He has this name even if he does not have a child. This is because the term refers not only to personal relationships, but also his legal rights and powers over people as well as property. Indeed, it is even possible to call an infant a paterfamilias, provided he has the legal powers implicit in the term. When a paterfamilias dies, every male person who is subject to his power will then begin to have his own familia, as each of them will enter the status of being paterfamilias. Harvey number 44 tells us the different types of power structures inherent in the Roman family, using the terms sui juris, which means legally independent, and alieni juris, or under someone else's power. So the only person in a Roman family who was sui juris, or legally independent, was the paterfamilias. Everyone under his authority were alieni juris, legally under someone else's power, by virtue of being in potestas, power, manus, hand, or mancipium, possession. The definitions of two of these three terms are outlined in the selection, but here's a brief overview with some additional information about mancipium. So those in potestas were slaves and children, both by birth and by adoption. Only women could be under the manus of a man, and there were three ways that a woman could become under the manus of a man: cohabitation without marriage, a marriage ceremony with a sacrifice to Jupiter Farius, or a ceremony in which the bride was fictitiously sold to her husband's family. Mancipium isn't defined by your book, but is the Latin word for the power that the paterfamilias has over his freed persons. Harvey's selection number 45 tells us exactly how powerful the paterfamilias was. It states the paterfamilias has the power to imprison, beat, chain, compel to forced labor in the fields, and even put to death his son, even if his son is already of advanced age and engaged in political life, and has reached the highest magisterial offices and is winning glory for his actions on behalf of the state. Very few legal enactments limited the power of the paterfamilias. This amount of control over those in his authority was unique to Roman society. According to this passage, these extraordinary powers were granted to inspire in children greater loyalty and devotion to their parents, but probably the father most of all. Examples of this use of power include the story from this passage of the father dragging his son from the speaker's platform and executing him, as well as the real-life example that inspired this anecdote of Cassius, who killed his son, which is Harvey number 46. Although there were few legal restrictions upon the potestas of the paterfamilias, there were social constraints. Society looked down on harsh treatment of wives, children, or slaves. The first passage on this page, Harvey number 47 by Seneca, is about how emperors should treat their subjects, but illustrates how the public will express their opinion on the father's exercise of his right to condemn his children. The anecdotes he lists shows how there is approval for just punishment rather than the immediate sentence of death. And Seneca states, a father should be slow to kill his own family members. Indeed, after killing a family member, he should desire to restore them, and in the act of execution, after long hesitation, should feel sorry for considering the act. I believe that a father who condemns too quickly should be censured more than a father who condemns too harshly. Harvey number 48 shows a similar situation. Pliny castigates a severe father and encourages tolerance. Implicit in this selection is the social inacceptability of a paterfamilias immoderately punishing someone under his control. And Pliny states, I do not want you to ever treat your son too harshly or severely. Remember that he is a boy just as you as yourself once were. Therefore, bear in mind that you are the father, so that you may remember that you are a human being, and so is your son. Now let's talk about some ways that a person could become sui juris, that is, of their own free will. So without the death of the paterfamilias, children and slaves could be freed or manumitted. Freed children and slaves became sui juris and were free to set up their own families as paterfamilias. Only the males, though. However, most people only became sui juris and paterfamilias of their own families after the death of their own paterfamilias. So sons become sui juris and patres familias, plural, of their own families. Daughters who were unmarried or in a sine manu marriage, which is a marriage in which she was not transferred to the potestas of her husband's family, become sui juris, meaning that yes, some women in Rome could be independent, where daughters in cum manu marriages would remain in the potestas of their husband's family. All of this is outlined in Harvey number 49. But now let's talk about marriage. Marriage in Rome was basically created to, and its main purpose was to create legitimate heirs. Roman law focuses on defining marriage and the production of legitimate heirs. This is because a boy would replace his father as paterfamilias of his own family, whereas a girl would marry and produce new children for another family. Due to these goals, Roman law was focused on defining marriage and the production of legitimate children. With the need to produce as many children as possible, it was typical for women to marry at a young age. It was also common for the wife to be significantly younger than her husband. You can see this in Harvey number 52, which are grave inscriptions that show age differences between husband and wife. And Harvey number 53, which lists unfortunate brides who died before marriage. Both bride and groom needed to have reached puberty, which was 14 for boys and 12 for girls. Girls usually married shortly after puberty, aka the start of menstruation. Many boys, however, waited until their mid-20s to marry. Some aristocratic girls entered their arranged marriages between 10 and 13 in order to cement political bonds created through marriages more quickly. It was very common, therefore, to have age differences of 5 to 10 years between husbands and wife. However, as we learned in our lecture on city living, there was no guarantee that even at a young age, tragedy wouldn't strike. Harvey number 53 gives the epitaphs of two young girls who died just before marriage. Harvey number 54 and 55 shows just how devastating the breakage of a marriage from death could be, even with this huge age difference. With life expectancy as low as it was in the ancient world, the premature death of either husband or wife often broke up marriages. Even though Romans frequently married very young, wives often succumbed early due to an early death due to childbirth and the difficulties associated with it. Now, as I've been talking about, there were two different types of marriages in Rome. Marriage sine manu, which is where the wife stays under the potestas of her own paterfamilias, or marriage cum manu, which is where the wife transfers to the potestas of her husband's paterfamilias. So Harvey number 50 lists the definition of legal marriage. The first selection on your screen tells us that consent is key, though the woman's consent was often predicated on her paterfamilias granting consent on her behalf. It states, the men must have reached the age of puberty and women must be of marriageable age. This is the case of all citizens, whether they are sui juris or aliening juris. In the case of those who are aliening juris, aka women, however, they must receive the consent of the father in whose power they are. This selection then goes on to list types of marriages that were forbidden. People may not marry a direct family ascendant or descendant. So father and daughter could not marry, grandfather and granddaughter, mother and son, grandmother and grandson, and so on. Marriage between such people are to be considered criminal and incestuous. The same is true in the case of persons adopted. People in the place of parents or children too are unable to marry one another. Thus you may not marry a woman who is your adopted daughter or granddaughter, even if you should emancipate her. Similar prohibitions are in effect for people who are in parallel relations. Of course, brother and sister are not allowed to marry, even in cases in which they have only one parent in common, so stepchildren. In the case of an adopted sister, intermarriage is not allowed as long as the woman's adoptive status continues. If, however, the adoption should be dissolved through emancipation, then there is no restriction to a brother marrying his former adoptive sister. But what made a suitable husband? So marriage was an important milestone, especially for girls, as it represented their coming of age. Romans didn't require a ceremony, but that doesn't mean marriage wasn't important. In lower class marriages, these were not arranged. So brides and grooms had the freedom to choose their respective spouse. However, in aristocracy, arranged marriages were much more common. In such cases, the groom or his paterfamilias would consult with the bride's parents. Only then would the girl be consulted. So Harvey selection number 51, which is Pliny recommending someone to be a groom, tells us what aristocrats would look for in an arranged marriage. A few things that he points out are that he's from Brixia, which still retains its simple frugality. And so this boy is himself frugal. Pliny says that there is nothing in his family heritage that you would not be happy to have in your own family. Thus, with tradition and family heritage being so important to the Romans, he did not have any skeletons in his closet. Examples of heritage given include severity, gravity, prudence, and loyalty, plus an implied political prowess, as Pliny makes sure to list all of the magistracies that this boy's family members have held. Looks were also important. This boy has a handsome face with a nice, healthy red complexion, and his father is very rich, and so wealth was also important. So now let's look at what was the marriage ceremony like, even though it wasn't necessarily required. So this is a generalized account of an upper-class wedding as it appears in literature. There could be many variations of detail, and there could be many different forms of marriage. So the favorite season to get married was June. This is because June is the month of Juno, the goddess of marriage. And there was a strict wardrobe that the bride had to wear. The bride's dress and appearance were ritually prescribed. Her hair was arranged in 6 locks with woolen fillets, which are headbands, around her head. Her dress was a straight white woven tunic fastened at the waist with the knot of Hercules. She wore a veil that was flame-colored, the flammeum, and her shoes were of the same color. Friends and clients of both families gathered in the bride's father's house. The bridegroom arrived, words of consent were spoken, and the matron of honor, the pronuba, performed the ceremony of linking the bride's and groom's hands, the dextrarum junctio. This was followed by a sacrifice, generally of a pig, and in imperial times, the marriage contract, which involved the dowry, being signed. Then the guests raised a cry of feliciter, good luck, and there was a wedding feast, usually at the expense of the bridegroom. The most important part of the ceremony then took place. The bride was escorted in procession to the bridegroom's house, deductio, closely accompanied by 3 young boys. The groom had previously gone ahead to their new house and was there to welcome her. The groom carries his wife over the threshold to avert an ill-omened stumble. In the house, she touched fire and water, was taken to the bedchamber and undressed by uniwiri, which are women who have only known one husband, and then the bridegroom was admitted. These people would then leave the room and stand outside and sing a song while the marriage was consummated. This song was called the Epithalamium, the wedding song outside the door. But just like modern times, marriage wasn't always happy. Divorce, like marriage, required no legal act. Divorce required that the husband repay the wife's full dowry, though this was only a concern for the upper classes. The husband was only allowed to keep portions of the dowry if there were children from the marriage, 1/5 per child, or if the wife had been convicted of adultery. Many wives also outlived their older husbands, and it was not uncommon for husbands to lose their wives during childbirth, as we mentioned. By the 1st century BCE, divorce was a completely normal thing to happen. The Emperor Augustus chose to pass a law condemning adultery as a factor that was detrimental to his focus on family values. Therefore, our surviving evidence, with its evidence on describing marriage and family life in traditional terms only, gives very few examples of adultery. So let's look at some reasons why a man might choose to divorce his wife. Harvey number 56 speaks about a common reason for divorce. Since marriage was intended to produce heirs, a husband would divorce his wife if she didn't produce heirs. In fact, according to this passage, the first ever divorce in Rome happened because of this. It states, from the foundation of the city in 753 BCE until its 523rd year, 231 BCE, no husband and wife ever asked for a divorce. Spurius Carullius was the first to divorce his wife because of her inability to produce children. Members of the aristocracy often married and divorced multiple times, often for trivial reasons, just for political advancement. This can be seen in Harvey number 57, which lists the many marriages and divorces of Augustus, often for trivial reasons. For example, Augustus was engaged to the daughter of Publius Servilius Isauracus, but it never happened because he then got engaged to Claudia, only to end due to a disagreement. Augustus then married Scribonia and ended this due to the perversity of her habits. However, one thing that is very interesting is that having multiple wives was not a reason for divorce, as Harvey number 58 tells us. There were many terms for wife in Latin, but it doesn't seem like having multiple was a reason for divorce. It's also hard to tell if the wives of the man mentioned in Harvey number 58 were married to this man at the same time or after death and or divorce. Harvey number 59 lists the legal definitions of adultery. Although it was considered to be a serious offense because it introduced the possibility of illegitimate heirs to a paterfamilias estate, formal legal procedure against adultery did not exist until Augustus. As part of his program of moral restoration after his victory in the civil wars, Augustus enacted several laws intended to reinstitute the integrity of Roman familia. The most significant of these laws was the Lex Julia de Adulteriis, passed in 18 BCE. This law made adultery a criminal offense and created a new court to decide cases involving adultery. The law defined adultery as a woman having sexual relations with a man other than her husband. Note that this means that a man could have sexual relations with a woman other than his wife with no legal repercussions. This text of Paulus describes the actions that could be taken against adulterous wives and their lovers. Again, no repercussions for men. Much of the concerns expressed relate to the rights of the father and the husband of the woman. In all of the examples given, sine manu marriages, where the woman stays under the control of her paterfamilias and not her husband's power, are assumed, and so the daughter was still aliena juris, not independent, under the control of the paterfamilias of her own family. So it states, it is permitted to the father, natural or adoptive, to kill his daughter's adulterous lover, as well as his daughter, when he catches them in the act, either in his own house or in the house of his son-in-law. The law also states that a man who isn't the paterfamilias can kill his daughter, even though she's not in his potestas. Moving on, it states only the following types of persons are legal for the husband to kill, provided he catches them in the act of adultery. Persons of bad reputation, those who sell their bodies for profit, slaves, and freedmen. He does not have the right to kill his wife, however, as she is under the potestas of her father's family. Under this excerpt, it is interesting to note that a husband can kill almost any man who commits adultery with his wife, except a Roman citizen. In marriages sine manu, he cannot even kill his wife. And yet, if a husband kills his wife when he catches her in adultery, he is treated with leniency because the shock of the deed means that he acted out of rashness, not maliciousness. Note again, nothing is said about if a man cheats on his wife. In fact, it is assumed that a true Roman man wouldn't commit adultery, as is evidenced by the list of men it is acceptable to kill. Also, after the husband has killed his wife's adulterous lover, he should immediately divorce her and declare and announce within a 3-day period her crime. At the same time, if a husband catches his wife in the act of adultery and does not divorce her, he can be accused of being a pimp, which the third excerpt tells us. In addition, if the adultery is with a woman who is a merchant or runs a shop, it doesn't count as adultery. This means adultery laws only apply to the daughters of the elites. Finally, the last bullet point, in the case of men, sexual intercourse with the female slave should not be considered adultery unless the act decreases the monetary value of a slave belonging to another person, or the act should be done to gain access to the slave's mistress. This is the final piece of evidence, here at least, that men having sexual relations with the slave or anyone else is not considered adultery. This is because slaves were seen as the property and not people, and owners, aka the paterfamilias, could do what he wanted with them regardless of gender. So now we can see here a list of some retaliation against adulterous wives. So Harvey number 60 shows a curse written on an 8-year-old's tombstone, which is a man cursing his wife. She says, as thanks for her manumission, she pursued an adulterous lover, defrauded her patron, her husband, and stole away from him. Female slaves would often be freed so that their owners could legally marry them, since a citizen couldn't marry a slave. And so this person is cursing his wife for being unfaithful and not wanting to marry him, and yet, as the curse goes on to reveal, he's having sexual relations with 2 other slaves, and this was okay. Harvey number 61 tells us of the goddess Weriplaka. Weriplaka is the goddess dedicated to ending marital strife. This passage describes a temple to the goddess Weriplaka, whose name means man-pleaser. This passage shows how, in a relationship of equals, it is the man who must be placated. How can it be an equal yoke of love if there is honor owed to the majesty of the husband? Then the author, Valerius Maximus, states, I believe this goddess deserves special worship with unique and exquisite sacrifices, as her very name emphasizes the honor owed to the majesty of the husband by the wife in the equal yoke of love. Valerius Maximus in this passage even says she only deserves special attention because she is devoted to placating men. Harvey number 62 shows multiple instances of women being killed by their husbands for being adulterous. Neither of the texts in this excerpt, however, tell us what happened, if anything, to the murdering husband. Finally, Harvey number 63 talks about the defenestration, which is the throwing out of a window of a wife who was unfaithful. It states, for unknown reason, the praetor Plautius Silvanus threw his wife Apronia out of the window of their house and killed her. His father-in-law Lucius Apronius immediately had him arrested and taken before the Emperor Tiberius. Sine manu marriages protected women from harsh retaliation by their husbands, since only their paterfamilias could punish them. In Harvey number 63, the story of an aristocratic, it's the story of an aristocratic marital intrigue, murder, and mystery. What the excerpted bit shows is that it is not the state that initiates the action, but rather the woman's father.